They surrounded his house in the darkness before dawn, swords drawn, hearts burning with hatred, believing that by sunrise everything would be over. One strike, they thought, and the message that had shaken Makkah for 13 years would finally be silenced. But what they did not know was that history was about to turn, not in their favor, but in a way that would echo until the end of time. Before we walk into that night and witness how Allah protected His messenger, take a moment to reflect on where you are listening from. Thank you for being part of Islamic Insight channel. Tell us in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love learning about Islam and the life of the Prophet, subscribe and stay with us on this journey. Makkah was not simply a city carved into rock and desert. It was a symbol of power, ancestry, and control. The Aqabah stood at its center, built by Prophet Ibrahim and his son Ismail. Peace be upon them both, as a house dedicated to the worship of one God. Yet over generations, that pure devotion had been buried under layers of idolatry. 360 idols encircled the Kaaba. Each tribe clung to its carved stone, each family to its inherited ritual. The Quraysh profited from this system. Pilgrims came from every corner of Arabia, trade flourished, alliances were secured, and the status of Makkah remained unchallenged. Into this environment, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, known for 40 years as truthful and trustworthy, stood and declared with calm certainty that there is no deity worthy of worship except Allah alone. The message was simple, yet it threatened everything. It dismantled the spiritual authority of the idols. It questioned the moral corruption of society. It spoke against burying daughters alive, against cheating in trade, against arrogance of lineage. The Quran descended in powerful waves, recited in a voice that caused even hardened hearts to tremble. It spoke of resurrection, of accountability, of a day when wealth and sons would not benefit anyone except the one who comes to Allah with a sound heart. For some, these words pierced through pride and awakened faith. For others, they felt like an attack on their identity. The earliest believers paid a heavy price. Bilal ibn Rabah was dragged into the desert, pinned under stones, whipped under the scorching sun, yet with cracked lips he repeated, "One, one." Sumayya bint Khayyat refused to renounce her faith and was killed, becoming the first martyr in Islam. Yasir, her husband, also gave his life. Ammar, their son, endured torture that shook his body but never uprooted belief from his heart. The Prophet passed by them in their suffering and said with promise and certainty, "Patience, O family of Yasir, for your meeting place is paradise." Those words were not poetry. They were truth grounded in revelation. The Quraysh escalated their tactics. They mocked him publicly, calling him a poet, a magician, a madman. They placed filth on his back while he prayed. They tried to negotiate, offering wealth, leadership, and marriage into the most noble families if only he would soften his message. His response was unwavering. Even if they placed the sun in his right hand and the moon in his left, he said, he would not abandon this call until Allah made it prevail, or he perished in the attempt. This was not stubbornness. It was conviction born from revelation. Then came the social boycott. The clans of Banu Hashim and Banu al-Muttalib were cut off. No trade, no marriage, no interaction. They were forced into a narrow valley. Children cried from hunger. Leaves were eaten to survive. For nearly 3 years, they endured isolation while Makkah carried on outside as if nothing was happening. Eventually, a few among Quraysh felt shame and worked to end the boycott. When the document hanging inside the Kaaba was taken down, it was found that insects had eaten it except for the name of Allah, just as the Prophet had informed them. But relief was short-lived. In the same year, he lost his beloved wife Khadijah, the woman who believed in him when others rejected him, who spent her wealth for the sake of Islam, who comforted him when revelation first descended in the Cave of Hira. Soon after, His uncle Abu Talib passed away, the man who, though not a Muslim, had shielded him from tribal violence. Without these two pillars of support, Makkah became even more hostile. That year was remembered as the year of sorrow. Yet even in grief, revelation continued, reminding him that his Lord had not forsaken him and that what was coming would be greater than what had passed. While Makkah tightened its grip, something unexpected was unfolding beyond its borders. During the pilgrimage seasons, tribes from across Arabia would gather in Makkah. Among them were men from Yathrib, a city north of Makkah, torn by decades of tribal warfare between Aqabah and Khazraj. They were exhausted by bloodshed. They had Jewish neighbors who spoke of a coming prophet, and when they encountered Muhammad and heard the Quran, they felt that this might be the one they had been warned about. A small group embraced Islam quietly and returned home carrying the message. Islam spread in Yathrib with remarkable speed. Within a year, 12 men returned to Makkah and pledged themselves to worship Allah alone, to avoid major sins, to speak truth, and to obey in righteousness. The Prophet sent Musab ibn Umayr with them to teach the Quran. Musab was young, gentle, and wise. Through his efforts, Islam entered nearly every home in Yathrib. Leaders like Sa'd ibn Mu'adh and Usayd ibn Hudayr accepted Islam, and with their acceptance, entire clans followed. The following year, 73 men and 2 women came secretly during the pilgrimage season. They met the Prophet at night in the valley of Aqabah, away from the eyes of Quraysh. This meeting was not only about faith, it was about protection. They pledged to defend him as they would defend their own families. They knew this would mean confrontation with the rest of Arabia. When Al-Abbas, the Prophet's uncle who was not yet Muslim, warned them of the seriousness of what they were promising, they did not withdraw. They affirmed their commitment with resolve. This was the second pledge of Aqabah, and it marked a turning point. A door had opened. A city was ready to receive him. After this pledge, revelation granted permission for migration. The earth of Allah, the Quran reminds, is vast. The believers in Makkah began leaving in small groups. They slipped away quietly to avoid detection. Some were intercepted and dragged back. Others managed to escape with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They left behind homes they had built, businesses they had nurtured, even relatives they loved. Faith demanded sacrifice, and they responded without hesitation. Umar ibn al-Khattab migrated openly, sword at his side, daring anyone to stop him. Most, however, left in secrecy. Makkah slowly realized that its control was weakening. Islam was no longer a confined minority within its walls. It was relocating, reorganizing, and preparing to stand on its own. Abu Bakr had longed to migrate. He had prepared 2 camels and waited for permission. Each time he asked, the Prophet told him to wait. Perhaps Allah would grant him a companion. Abu Bakr hoped in his heart that he would be that companion. Then one day, at an unusual hour, when the heat of Makkah kept people indoors, the Prophet came to his house. Abu Bakr sensed immediately that something significant had happened. Permission had been given. The migration was no longer a distant plan. It was about to begin. The city that had once cradled the message would soon witness its departure, and the journey from persecution to promise would unfold step by step under the watchful care of Allah. The decision to kill him was not made in anger alone. It was calculated, debated, and sharpened like the blades they intended to use. The leaders of Quraysh gathered in Dar al Nadwah, the council house where the most powerful men of Makkah would meet whenever a crisis threatened their authority. They were no longer dealing with a small group of persecuted followers. Islam had found a new home in Yathrib. The pledges at Aqabah meant that Muhammad was no longer unprotected. If he reached that city safely, he would not just be a preacher, he would be a leader with loyal supporters willing to defend him with their lives. That possibility terrified them. One voice suggested imprisonment, to chain him until death overtook him. Another proposed exile, to push him out of Makkah and let the desert swallow his influence. but both ideas were dismissed. They feared that imprisonment would turn him into a martyr in the eyes of his followers, and exile would only allow his message to spread beyond their control. It was then that a more sinister proposal emerged. Select a strong young man from every major clan, arm each of them with a sword, and strike him simultaneously. In that way, his blood would be shared among all tribes, and Banu Hashim would be unable to seek revenge against everyone at once. The plan was ruthless, but in their minds it was perfect. They agreed. The night was chosen. Unseen by them, revelation had already descended. Allah informed his messenger of their plot. The Prophet did not panic, nor did he rush blindly into the desert. Every step was deliberate, guided by trust in Allah and careful planning. He went to the house of Abu Bakr and informed him that permission for migration had been granted. Abu Bakr wept, not from fear, but from relief and honor. For years he had hoped to be the one who would accompany the Prophet on this journey. Now that hope was becoming reality, they had prepared in advance. 2 camels had been kept ready, well-fed and strong. A trustworthy guide, Abdullah ibn Uraykit, who was not Muslim but known for his reliability and skill in navigating desert routes, was quietly arranged. Supplies were gathered. Roles were assigned. This was faith in Allah combined with human effort at its finest. That final night in Makkah carried a strange stillness. Outside the house of the Prophet, young men from every clan waited in the darkness, swords in their hands, whispering to one another, confident that dawn would bring an end to what they saw as a rebellion. Inside, the Prophet asked Ali ibn Abi Talib to sleep in his bed, wrapped in his green cloak. It was not a reckless request. It was an act of courage and trust. Ali accepted without hesitation. The Prophet also instructed him to return the trusts that people had left with him. Even those who plotted his death had entrusted him with their valuables. Such was his reputation for honesty. He would not leave Makkah with a single trust unreturned. Then, in the depth of that night, he stepped toward the door. The assassins were positioned outside, waiting for him to emerge at dawn. He recited from Surah Yasin as he walked out. The Quran tells us that Allah placed a barrier before them and a barrier behind them so they could not see. He passed through their midst unnoticed. It was not spectacle. It was protection. By the time the first light of dawn began to stretch across the sky, he was already gone. When the young men rushed inside and found Ali in the bed, confusion and fury erupted. Their carefully constructed plan had unraveled before it even began. Instead of heading directly north toward Yathrib, the Prophet and Abu Bakr moved south, in the opposite direction. It was a strategic decision to confuse their pursuers. They climbed the rugged slopes of Mount Thor, a steep and rocky ascent that would exhaust even the strongest traveler. The cave at its summit was narrow and uninviting. Abu Bakr entered first, clearing it, blocking small holes with pieces of cloth to protect the Prophet from any harm. Only when he was satisfied did he invite him inside. The cave would become their refuge for 3 nights. When Quraysh discovered the escape, rage consumed them. A large reward was announced for anyone who could capture Muhammad and Abu Bakr, dead or alive. Skilled trackers were dispatched. They followed footprints across the harsh terrain until they reached the very base of Mount Thor. Step by step, they climbed higher, tracing signs that pointed directly to the cave. Inside, Abu Bakr felt the tension rise. The sounds of footsteps echoed against stone. He whispered to the Prophet, his voice trembling not for his own safety, but out of fear that harm might reach the messenger of Allah. He said that if one of them were to look down at his feet, they would see us. The Prophet replied with calm certainty, words preserved in authentic narrations and immortalized in the Quran. Do not grieve. Indeed, Allah is with us. In that confined space, surrounded by danger, tranquility descended. It was not denial of the threat. It was absolute confidence in divine protection. According to authentic reports, signs appeared at the entrance of the cave that discouraged the pursuers. A spider had spun its web across the opening, and a dove nested there. The men of Quraysh looked and reasoned that if someone had entered recently, such fragile signs would not be intact. They turned back. The search party stood within steps of the cave, yet they left empty-handed. It was a moment that demonstrated a profound truth. When Allah protects, no force on earth can overcome that protection. During those 3 days, a quiet network of support operated with precision. Abdullah, the son of Abu Bakr, would spend the day in Makkah gathering information, then slip out at night to report the latest developments. Asma bint Abi Bakr brought food, tying the provisions with pieces of her belt when she found nothing else to use, earning the title Dat Anitakain, the woman of the 2 belts. Amir ibn Fuhaira tended sheep nearby, allowing the flock to pass over their tracks to erase footprints. Every detail reflected planning and reliance intertwined. After 3 nights, when the search had subsided, they merged and began the long journey north along a lesser-known coastal route. The desert stretched before them in endless waves of sand and rock. Days were hot and relentless. Nights were cold and silent. Yet the journey was marked by moments that would become signs for generations to come. One of those moments came in the form of Suraqah ibn Malik. When news of the reward reached him, ambition stirred within him. The bounty promised by Quraysh was substantial, and the idea of capturing the most wanted man in Arabia carried both wealth and prestige. He mounted his horse and set out in pursuit after disguising his intention from others who had heard rumors of travelers along the coast. As he approached, he could see figures in the distance. Victory seemed close. Then suddenly his horse stumbled and its legs sank into the sand. He fell. He rose, brushed himself off, and tried again. Once more the horse sank unnaturally, as if the earth itself was resisting him. Fear began to replace ambition. He realized that something beyond ordinary circumstances was at play. In desperation, he called out, asking for safety. The Prophet stopped and listened. Suraqah admitted his intention and asked for protection. Not only did the Prophet grant it, he spoke words that must have sounded unimaginable in that barren landscape. He told Suraqah that one day he would wear the bracelets of Kisra, the Emperor of Persia. At that time, Persia was a superpower. Its wealth and influence dwarfed anything in Arabia. The idea that this small, hunted group would one day overcome such an empire seemed impossible. Yet the promise was spoken with certainty. Years later, during the caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab, when the treasures of Persia were brought to Medina after its fall, Umar summoned Suraqah and placed the bracelets of Kisra upon his arms, fulfilling the prophecy exactly as it had been foretold. What began as a pursuit driven by greed ended as a testimony to truth. The journey through the desert continued with trust at its core. Each challenge reinforced a lesson. The assassination plot revealed that human schemes collapse before divine will. The cave demonstrated that protection can come in ways unseen and unexpected. The encounter with Suraqah showed that even an enemy can become a witness to prophecy. Step by step, the path from Makkah to Medina was being written not only in footprints across sand, but in events that would shape the future of a nation. For days, the people of Yathrib had been living in a state of restless anticipation. Every morning after the Fajr prayer, they would walk to the outskirts of the city, scanning the horizon where the desert met the sky. The heat would intensify as the sun climbed higher, and by midday they would return home, disappointed but still hopeful. This had become their routine. They knew he was on his way. The pledge at Aqabah had not been a symbolic promise. It was a commitment sealed with sincerity and risk. Now they were waiting for the man who would transform their divided city into a united community. Then, one afternoon, as the people were returning from their usual watch, A Jewish man who had climbed a fort to look for something else noticed figures approaching in the distance. He recognized immediately what others longed to see. He called out at the top of his voice, announcing the arrival of the one they had been waiting for. In an instant, the streets of Yathrib filled with movement. Men left their work. Women stepped out of their homes. Children ran ahead, unable to contain their excitement. It was not a reception arranged by politics or spectacle. It was a reception born from faith and longing. The Prophet first arrived in Quba, a small settlement on the outskirts of the city. There he stayed for several days in the home of Kulthum ibn al-Hidm. During this time, he laid the foundation of a mosque that would later be praised in the Quran as a mosque founded upon righteousness from the first day. It was simple in structure, built from what was available, yet its significance would endure across centuries. Prayer was established openly. The call to worship echoed without fear. For the first time since the beginning of Revelation, the believers were not hiding in secret valleys or isolated homes. They were standing together in safety. From Quba, he prepared to enter the heart of the city. On the way, when the time for the Friday prayer arrived, he stopped in the valley of Ranuna and led the first Jumu'ah prayer among the community of believers in this new land. It was more than a ritual gathering. It was a declaration that a new chapter had begun. The scattered individuals who had once been hunted in Makkah were now forming an organized society rooted in worship and guidance. As he approached Yathrib, every clan hoped for the honor of hosting him. Leaders of Abus and Khazraj came forward, each taking hold of the reins of his camel, pleading that he stay with them. They spoke with sincerity and eagerness, not competition driven by pride, but by love and devotion. The Prophet responded gently, asking them to let the camel go, saying that it was commanded. This was not a random decision. It was trust in divine direction, even in matters that seemed simple. The camel moved forward slowly through the narrow streets, people walking alongside, watching every step until it finally knelt at a specific spot. That land belonged to two orphan boys from Banu Najjar, Sal and Suhail. The Prophet refused to take it as a gift, insisting on purchasing it properly. This decision reflected the principles that would shape the new society. Rights were to be respected. Property was to be honored. Justice began from the very first moment. On that land, the Masjid al Nabawi would rise. Until the mosque and his living quarters were constructed, he stayed in the home of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. The story of that stay reveals humility that still moves hearts. Abu Ayyub lived in a two-story home and insisted that the Prophet take the upper floor. The Prophet preferred the lower floor for the sake of accessibility, so that visitors would not need to climb. Abu Ayyub and his wife felt uneasy walking above him, worried that even a drop of water might fall through the ceiling. One night, when a water container spilled, they used their only blanket to dry the floor quickly, fearing it might seep through. Their love was practical and protective. Construction of the mosque began immediately. It was not outsourced or delegated. The Prophet himself carried bricks alongside his companions. He worked with his hands, his clothes dusted with earth, reciting lines that reminded them that true life is the life of the hereafter. The walls were built from mud bricks. The roof was supported by palm trunks. The floor was simple earth. Yet within those humble walls, revelation would descend, decisions of state would be made, delegations would be received, and generations would learn. The mosque was not merely a place of prayer. It was the heart of the emerging Ummah. As the Muhajirun continued to arrive from Makkah, they came with little to their names. Many had left behind wealth, homes, and family ties. They arrived as migrants, carrying faith but not possessions. The Ansar, the helpers of Medina, opened their homes with generosity that defies ordinary explanation. This was not hospitality for a day or two. It was shared living, shared wealth, shared responsibility. The Prophet formalized this spirit by establishing bonds of brotherhood between individuals from the Muhajirun and the Ansar. This act transformed charity into partnership. Each pair was bound not by blood, but by belief. Abdur Rahman ibn Auf was paired with Sa'd ibn Rabi. Sa'd offered him half of his wealth and even proposed to divorce one of his wives so that Abdur Rahman could marry her after her waiting period, ensuring he would have stability. The offer reflected sincerity, not compulsion. Abdur Rahman, however, declined with dignity and asked only to be shown the marketplace. He began trading modestly, building his wealth through effort and honesty. In time, he became prosperous again, proving that the migration was not an end, but a beginning. This brotherhood dissolved tribal hierarchies that had defined Arabia for centuries. A nobleman from Quraysh could be paired with a farmer from Medina. A former slave could stand equal beside a tribal chief. The standard was faith and righteousness, not lineage. The Quran later praised the Ansar, describing how they preferred others over themselves, even when they were in need. That verse was not abstract praise. It was a description of lived reality. The social fabric of Medina began to change rapidly. Markets were established independent of unfair practices. The call to prayer was introduced after Abdullah ibn Zayd saw it in a dream that was confirmed by the Prophet. Bilal was chosen to deliver it, his voice rising over the city, calling people to success. Disputes were brought to the Prophet for judgment, and justice was administered without favoritism. The once divided city of Yathrib gradually became known as Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet. Yet this transformation did not erase all challenges. The presence of different tribes and religious communities required careful governance. The Prophet established agreements that ensured mutual protection and defined rights and responsibilities. Loyalty was redefined. Allegiance was no longer to tribe above all else, but to a shared covenant grounded in faith and justice. What makes this period remarkable is not only that a persecuted group found safety, but that they built something enduring from hardship. The migration was not simply an escape from oppression. It was the deliberate construction of a society guided by revelation and balanced by wisdom. Every brick laid in the mosque, every bond formed between brothers, every prayer offered in congregation reinforced a truth that had been tested in Makkah, that patience under pressure leads to strength under guidance. From the anxious watch on the outskirts of Yathrib to the moment the camel knelt, from the first prayer in Quba to the establishment of brotherhood, the journey unfolded with clarity and purpose. What began as a secret escape under the cover of night was becoming the foundation of a civilization. The people who once hid their faith were now living it openly. The city that had long been fractured by rivalry was learning unity through belief, and at the center of it all stood a messenger whose trust in Allah had carried him from a house surrounded by swords to a community ready to stand by him with their lives. The migration had secured safety, but safety alone does not build a civilization. Medina was a living city, layered with tribes, histories, loyalties, and tensions that predated Islam by generations. The Aws and Khazraj had fought bitter wars, most notably the Battle of Bu'ath, leaving wounds that were not easily forgotten. Jewish tribes such as Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza lived within and around the city, each with their own alliances and interests. If this new community was to survive, it required more than shared enthusiasm. It required structure, justice, and clarity. It required governance rooted in revelation, yet practical enough to manage real human complexity. The Prophet drafted what later came to be known as the Constitution of Madinah. It was not a symbolic statement, but a written covenant defining the relationships between the various groups in the city. It declared that the believers, whether from Quraysh or Yathrib, were one Ummah distinct from others, At the same time, it acknowledged the Jewish tribes as communities with their own religion, granting them protection and religious freedom so long as they upheld the agreement. Mutual defense was established. If Medina were attacked, all signatories would stand together. Blood money and ransom customs were regulated. Justice was to be upheld collectively. Disputes would ultimately be referred to Allah and His Messenger. This document did something revolutionary in the Arabian context. It shifted identity from tribal supremacy to covenantal responsibility. Loyalty was no longer blind allegiance to bloodline. It was commitment to a shared moral and political order. The authority of the Prophet was not imposed by force, but accepted through pledge and trust. Governance became an extension of revelation. Decisions were not arbitrary. They were guided by principles of fairness, consultation, and accountability. In those early months, the community felt the weight of its transformation. The Muhajirun were still rebuilding their livelihoods. The Ansar were adjusting to their expanded households and responsibilities. The Prophet moved among them, teaching, judging disputes, encouraging trade, reminding them of prayer and patience. The mosque served as the nucleus of this new order. It was a place of worship, a court of justice, a center of consultation, and a shelter for the poor, known as al-Sufa. Companions who had no family or wealth in Medina and dedicated themselves to learning and worship. No one was invisible in this society. Even the most vulnerable had a place. Yet challenges emerged from within. Not everyone who professed Islam did so with sincerity. Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, who had once anticipated leadership in Yathrib before the Prophet's arrival, harbored resentment. He and others like him displayed outward allegiance while concealing doubt and hostility. The Quran began to address this phenomenon directly, exposing hypocrisy as a spiritual disease. Surah al-Baqarah and Surah al-Munafiqun describe those who say, "We believe," yet in their hearts they do not believe. The existence of hypocrisy tested the community in subtle ways. It reminded them that faith is not measured by words alone, but by consistency in action and loyalty in hardship. Meanwhile, tension with Makkah did not disappear. The Quraysh had not forgotten their humiliation. Trade caravans continued to pass near Medina, and the political reality of Arabia was shifting. Revelation permitted the believers to defend themselves against aggression. The Quran states that permission to fight was granted to those who had been wronged and expelled from their homes unjustly. The migration had not ended conflict, it had repositioned the believers to face it with organization and unity, rather than vulnerability. In the midst of these developments came a moment that reshaped the spiritual identity of the community. For about 16 or 17 months after the migration, the Muslims prayed facing Jerusalem. This direction connected them to the legacy of earlier prophets and emphasized continuity of revelation. Yet the Prophet longed to face the Aqabah, the house built by Ibrahim and Ismail, as a sanctuary for pure monotheism. He would look toward the sky, awaiting instruction. Then revelation descended. Turn your face toward al-Masjid al-Haram. Wherever you are, turn your faces toward it. The command came during prayer. In the mosque of Banu Salama, as the companions stood in congregation, the direction changed. They physically turned from one orientation to another, aligning themselves with Makkah once again. This shift was not merely geographic. It was symbolic and decisive. The community was now spiritually distinct. Their identity was rooted directly in the legacy of Ibrahim, purified from the distortions of idolatry. The Kaaba, once surrounded by idols and controlled by those who rejected the message, remained the sacred center of their devotion even while they were physically distant from it. The change of Qibla also tested hearts. The Quran acknowledges that some would question the shift. Why change direction? What was the wisdom? Revelation answered clearly: to distinguish those who follow the messenger from those who turn back on their heels. Obedience, even when wisdom is not immediately apparent, became a mark of sincerity. The believers did not argue. They turned. As the months passed, the strength of the Muslim community became visible. Discipline in prayer structured their days. Charity purified their wealth. Fasting in Ramadan was prescribed, deepening their spiritual resilience. The call to sacrifice was no longer theoretical. It shaped daily life. The Prophet cultivated balance. He reminded them that this world is a field for the hereafter, that victory is not measured only by numbers or territory, but by steadfastness and obedience. Then came moments that would define their future. The Battle of Badr, though beyond the initial migration, was a direct consequence of the new order established in Medina. A small group of believers faced a much larger force from Makkah. Against overwhelming odds, they prevailed by the permission of Allah. The Quran describes angels sent to support them and emphasizes that victory comes not from strength alone, but from reliance on Allah. This event transformed the political landscape of Arabia. The once persecuted community was now recognized as a rising power. Trials continued. The Battle of Uhud brought painful lessons about obedience and consequence. The siege during the Battle of the Trench tested their endurance when Confederate forces surrounded Medina. Through each hardship, the foundations laid during the migration proved essential. Brotherhood sustained morale. The Constitution of Madinah structured alliances. The mosque remained the center of consultation and prayer. The Qibla unified their hearts in worship. Years later, the very city that had expelled the Prophet would witness his return. But this return was not fueled by vengeance. It was shaped by mercy. When the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was signed, many companions struggled to understand its apparent concessions, yet Revelation declared it a clear victory. 2 years after that treaty, when Quraysh violated its terms, the Prophet marched toward Makkah at the head of 10,000 believers. The city that once plotted his assassination opened its gates with minimal resistance. He entered humbly, head lowered in gratitude to Allah. There was no mass retribution. Instead, he declared a general amnesty, saying that whoever entered the house of Abu Sufyan or remained in their own homes would be safe. He approached the Aqabah, the sanctuary that had once been encircled by idols, and began removing them one by one, reciting the verse, "Truth has come and falsehood has vanished. Falsehood is ever bound to vanish." The idols fell. The house built by Ibrahim was restored to its original purpose. The journey that began with swords outside his door ended with the purification of the very sanctuary that symbolized monotheism. The migration from Makkah to Medina was never about escape alone. It was about transition. It was about moving from a phase of endurance to a phase of establishment, from isolation to community, from vulnerability to structured strength. It demonstrated that faith is not passive. It requires planning, sacrifice, courage, and patience. It showed that when believers anchor themselves in trust in Allah while acting responsibly within their circumstances, doors open in ways no human strategy could guarantee. What began in secrecy, under the cover of night, became the foundation of a civilization that would carry the message of the Quran across continents. The Hijrah was so transformative that it became the starting point of the Islamic calendar. Not the first revelation, not a military victory, but the migration. Because it marked the moment when belief moved from being persecuted within private hearts to shaping public life. From the council chamber in Makkah, where assassination was plotted, to the Cave of Thawr, where trust overcame fear, to the streets of Medina, where unity replaced division, to the eventual return to Makkah, where mercy triumphed over revenge, the journey stands as a living lesson. It teaches that hardship does not signal abandonment. It often signals preparation. It teaches that patience is not weakness, but strategic strength guided by faith. And above all, it teaches that when Allah promises support to His messenger and to those who believe, That promise unfolds with precision, even if its full wisdom is revealed only with time.